Imagine standing on the cliffs of Sagres in 1415, watching Portuguese ships disappear into the Atlantic's endless blue. Few could have predicted that this small kingdom on Europe's edge would soon chart the world's first global trade routes, connecting continents that had never known each other existed. The Portuguese Empire didn't emerge overnight. It was forged through centuries of daring voyages, technological innovation, and an insatiable hunger for exploration that would reshape human civilization itself. The story begins not with conquest, but with curiosity. After completing the Reconquista in 1249 and securing their borders against the Moors, the Portuguese found themselves in a unique position. Unlike their neighbors who could expand eastward into Europe, Portugal faced only the vast Atlantic Ocean, what others saw as a barrier. The Portuguese would transform into a highway to empire. Prince Henry the Navigator stands as the architect of this maritime revolution. Though he never sailed beyond Morocco himself, Henry established a school of navigation at Sagres that became Europe's premier center for maritime knowledge. Here, Portuguese cartographers, astronomers, and shipbuilders worked alongside Jewish mathematicians, Arab navigators, and Italian merchants, creating an unprecedented fusion of knowledge. Henry's vision was audacious: to find a sea route around Africa to reach the spice markets of Asia, bypassing the expensive overland routes controlled by Venice and the Ottoman Empire. The technological innovations that emerged from this collaboration were revolutionary. Portuguese shipwrights developed the caravel, a vessel that combined the best of Mediterranean and Atlantic shipbuilding traditions. These ships were faster and more maneuverable than the heavy galleons of other nations, with lateen-rigged sails that could catch winds from multiple directions. Equally important were advances in navigation. The Portuguese perfected the use of the astrolabe and compass, developed more accurate charts, and pioneered celestial navigation techniques that allowed them to sail far from sight of land. The breakthrough came in 1434, when Gil Eanes successfully rounded Cape Bojador, a feat many considered impossible. The Cape's violent waters and strong currents had destroyed countless vessels, earning it the fearsome reputation as a point of no return. Eanes's success opened the door to systematic exploration of Africa's Atlantic coast. Portuguese expeditions began venturing further south each year, establishing trading posts and claiming territory as they went. What they discovered transformed Europe's understanding of the world. The Portuguese encountered sophisticated African kingdoms like Mali and Songhai, civilizations that controlled vast gold mines and extensive trade networks. They found islands like Madeira and the Azores, uninhabited paradises perfect for sugar cultivation. Most significantly, they discovered that the African coastline continued far beyond what ancient geographers had imagined, suggesting that a sea route to Asia might indeed be possible. The economic implications were staggering. Portuguese traders returned to Lisbon with ships laden with African gold, ivory, and exotic woods. They established the first sugar plantations on Atlantic islands, creating a template that would later devastate the Americas. Most tragically, they initiated the Atlantic slave trade, purchasing human beings from African intermediaries and shipping them to work these plantations. This horrific commerce would endure for over 4 centuries, reshaping demographics across 3 continents. By 1460, Portuguese explorers had reached the Gold Coast of modern-day Ghana, where they built Elmina Castle, Europe's first permanent structure in sub-Saharan Africa. This fortress served as both trading post and slave depot. its dungeons holding thousands of Africans awaiting transport to Portuguese colonies. The wealth flowing from these activities funded further exploration and transformed Lisbon into one of Europe's most prosperous cities. The Portuguese crown understood that exploration required systematic support. They established the Casa da Guiné to regulate African trade, ensuring that the monarchy received its share of profits while providing licenses to private merchants. This public-private partnership model would become characteristic of Portuguese expansion, allowing rapid growth while maintaining royal control over strategic territories. Religious motivations intertwined with economic ones. The Portuguese saw themselves as crusaders carrying Christianity to pagan lands, a mission that provided moral justification for territorial expansion. Missionaries accompanied every expedition, establishing churches and attempting conversions. The papal bulls of the 1450s granted Portugal exclusive rights to African exploration, giving their enterprise divine sanction and international legitimacy. The culmination of these efforts came in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa's coastline did indeed provide passage to the Indian Ocean. After decades of incremental progress, the Portuguese had finally found their route to Asia. The implications were immediately clear. Whoever controlled this passage could dominate the spice trade and accumulate unprecedented wealth. Yet even as Dias was making his historic voyage, events in Spain were setting up a dramatic confrontation. Christopher Columbus, convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing west, had finally convinced Isabella and Ferdinand to fund his expedition. When Columbus returned in 1493, claiming to have reached the Indies, it created an international crisis. Two Christian kingdoms now claimed overlapping rights to newly discovered lands. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 resolved this dispute by dividing the world between Spain and Portugal along a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This seemingly arbitrary line would have profound consequences. It placed Brazil within Portugal's sphere, giving them their most valuable American colony more immediately. So it secured Portugal's exclusive rights to the African route to Asia, setting the stage for their transformation into a global empire. As the 15th century drew to a close, Portugal stood poised to achieve Prince Henry's century-old dream. They possessed the ships, navigation skills, and geographical knowledge necessary to reach Asia by sea. They had established a network of bases along the African coast to support such a voyage. Most importantly, they had developed the institutional frameworks and economic models needed to exploit whatever opportunities they might discover. The stage was set for Vasco da Gama's epic voyage to India, which would finally connect Europe directly to Asian markets and establish Portugal as the world's first truly global empire. But that transformation from European kingdom to maritime superpower would require not just reaching Asia, but conquering and controlling it. The next chapter of Portugal's story would unfold not in the familiar waters of the Atlantic, but in the vast and dangerous expanse of the Indian Ocean, where ancient civilizations and established powers would challenge Portuguese ambitions at every turn. The foundations laid during these crucial decades of the 15th century, technological innovation, institutional development, economic experimentation, and territorial expansion, would enable Portugal to achieve what no nation had ever accomplished before, creating an empire that literally spanned the globe, connecting continents and cultures in ways that would permanently alter the course of human history. With Vasco da Gama's successful voyage proving that a sea route to Asia was not only possible, but profitable, Portugal wasted no time in capitalizing on this monumental achievement. The Portuguese crown understood that controlling the spice trade meant controlling vast wealth, and they moved quickly to establish a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. The second expedition to India departed in 1500 under Pedro Alvarez Cabral, but this journey would yield an unexpected bonus. While sailing west to catch favorable winds around Africa, Cabral's fleet drifted too far and accidentally discovered Brazil. Though this discovery was likely unintentional, it proved fortuitous, as Brazil fell squarely within Portugal's sphere of influence according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. Cabral claimed the land for Portugal, but the immediate focus remained on the lucrative Asian trade routes. In India, the Portuguese faced a complex political landscape. The subcontinent was fragmented into numerous kingdoms, sultanates, and trading cities, each with their own rulers and interests. Rather than attempting wholesale conquest, the Portuguese adopted a more pragmatic approach. They sought to control key strategic points along the coast, while maintaining profitable relationships with local rulers. The man who would transform Portugal's tentative foothold in Asia into a formidable empire was Afonso de Albuquerque, appointed as the second viceroy of Portuguese India in 1509. Albuquerque was a brilliant strategist who understood that controlling the seas meant controlling trade. His vision was to establish a network of fortified bases that could protect Portuguese shipping, while denying rivals access to the most valuable trade routes. Albuquerque's first major target was Goa, a strategically located port on India's western coast. In 1510, Portuguese forces captured the city from the Bijapur Sultanate, establishing what would become the capital of Portuguese India. Goa's location made it an ideal base for controlling trade along the Malabar coast, and its natural harbor could accommodate large fleets. But Albuquerque's ambitions extended far beyond India. In 1511, Portuguese forces captured Malacca, the crucial port city that controlled the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. Malacca was the key to the spice trade, as virtually all shipping between China and India had to pass through its waters. By controlling Malacca, Portugal could tax and regulate the flow of goods between Asia's most important markets. The following year brought another spectacular success when Albuquerque's forces seized Hormuz, the island fortress that controlled the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Hormuz was already a wealthy trading center, profiting from the exchange of goods between Persia, Arabia, and India. Its capture gave Portugal control over another critical maritime choke point. These three conquests, Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, formed the strategic triangle of Portuguese power in Asia. From these bases, Portuguese fleets could patrol the Indian Ocean, protecting their own merchant ships while intercepting those of rivals. It was a system designed not just for trade, but for maritime dominance. The Portuguese approach in Asia was pragmatic rather than evangelical, at least initially. Unlike their later colonial efforts in the Americas, the Portuguese in Asia were primarily interested in trade, not territorial conquest or large-scale settlement. They established fortified trading posts called feitorias along the coast, typically on islands or easily defensible peninsulas. These bases allowed them to conduct business while maintaining security against both local threats and European rivals. The profits from this Asian trade were staggering. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were worth their weight in gold in European markets. A single successful voyage to Asia could yield profits of several 100%. The Portuguese crown claimed a monopoly on this trade, requiring all merchants to purchase licenses and pay taxes on their cargoes. But success bred competition. As word of Portugal's Asian riches spread throughout Europe, other nations began to take notice. The Dutch, in particular, were emerging as formidable maritime competitors. Having recently gained independence from Spain, the Dutch possessed both the naval expertise and commercial acumen to challenge Portuguese dominance. The Dutch approach differed significantly from the Portuguese model. Rather than relying primarily on royal expeditions, the Dutch organized joint stock companies that could raise private capital for overseas ventures. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, quickly became one of the most powerful commercial organizations in the world, with the authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. Meanwhile, back in Brazil, Portuguese colonization proceeded slowly at first. The initial focus remained on Asia, where profits were immediate and substantial. Brazil seemed to offer little beyond Brazil wood, a tree whose red dye was valuable, but hardly comparable to Asian spices. The Portuguese established a few coastal settlements and trading posts, but large-scale colonization awaited a more compelling economic incentive. That incentive came in the form of sugar. Portuguese colonists had successfully cultivated sugarcane on Atlantic islands like Madeira and São Tomé, developing both the agricultural techniques and labor systems needed for profitable production. Brazil's climate and soil proved ideal for sugar cultivation, and by the mid-16th century, sugar plantations were transforming the colony's economy. Sugar cultivation was labor-intensive, requiring year-round work in a hot, humid climate. Initially, the Portuguese attempted to use indigenous labor, but disease and resistance made this system unreliable. The solution was to import enslaved Africans, beginning what would become one of history's largest forced migrations. The Atlantic slave trade represented the dark underside of Portuguese expansion. Portuguese traders had been purchasing enslaved people from West African rulers since the 1440s, initially for use in Europe and Atlantic islands. The development of sugar plantations in Brazil created an enormous demand for enslaved labor, transforming what had been a relatively small trade into a massive system of human exploitation. Portuguese slave ships carried millions of Africans across the Atlantic over the next 3 centuries. The conditions were horrific, with enslaved people packed into ships' holds with minimal food, water, or sanitation. Many died during the crossing, their bodies thrown overboard. Those who survived faced lives of brutal exploitation on Brazilian plantations. The profits from sugar and slave labor gradually shifted Portuguese attention from Asia to the Americas. Brazil's economy grew rapidly, and the colony became increasingly important to Portugal's overall wealth. Cities like Salvador, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro emerged as major commercial centers, their prosperity built on sugar exports and slave labor. In Asia, meanwhile, Portuguese dominance was beginning to face serious challenges. The Dutch were systematically attacking Portuguese positions, using superior naval forces and commercial organization to seize key trading posts. The Dutch captured Malacca in 1641, dealing a severe blow to Portuguese power in Southeast Asia. The Portuguese also faced growing resistance from Asian rulers who had initially welcomed European trade, but grew suspicious of European territorial ambitions. The Mughal Empire in India, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and various Southeast Asian kingdoms began to limit Portuguese activities or support their rivals. Religious conflicts added another layer of complexity. Portuguese missionaries, particularly Jesuits, had initially been welcomed in many parts of Asia, achieving notable success in places like Goa and Nagasaki. However, their aggressive proselytizing and intolerance of local religious practices eventually provoked backlash. Japan expelled the Portuguese entirely in the 1630s, while other Asian rulers imposed restrictions on missionary activities. The strain of maintaining a global empire was also taking its toll on Portugal itself. The country's population was small, limiting the number of administrators, soldiers, and colonists available for overseas service. Many of Portugal's best men were dying of disease in tropical colonies or perishing in naval battles against Dutch and English competitors. Portugal's situation became even more precarious in 1580, when a succession crisis led to the union of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns under Philip II of Spain. Though Portugal retained its own government and colonial administration, the union made Portuguese territories targets for Spain's enemies, particularly the Dutch and English. The Dutch took full advantage of this situation, launching what amounted to a global war against Portuguese positions. Dutch fleets attacked Portuguese bases from Brazil to Macau, capturing territories and disrupting trade routes. The Dutch conquest of much of northeastern Brazil in the 1630s threatened one of Portugal's most valuable colonies. Portuguese resistance to these attacks was hampered by Spain's focus on its own colonial and European conflicts. Spanish resources were stretched thin by wars in Europe and rebellions in Catalonia and the Netherlands. Portugal's colonial empire often had to defend itself with minimal support from the mother country. The crisis deepened when local populations began to turn against Portuguese rule. In Brazil, Dutch promises of religious tolerance and commercial freedom attracted support from Portuguese colonists, while in Asia, local rulers increasingly viewed the Portuguese as weak and unreliable allies. By the 1640s, it had become clear that the union with Spain was hampering rather than helping Portuguese interests. Portuguese nobles and merchants increasingly favored independence, believing that Portugal could better defend its empire without Spanish entanglements. The catalyst for action came in 1640, when Spanish attempts to raise troops and taxes for European wars sparked a revolution in Lisbon. The Portuguese Restoration War began on December 1st, 1640, when Portuguese nobles stormed the royal palace in Lisbon and proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King João IV. The revolution was remarkably swift and successful, with Portuguese garrisons throughout the empire declaring their loyalty to the new king. However, independence did not immediately solve Portugal's colonial problems. The Dutch continued their attacks, and Portugal now had to fight a war against Spain while simultaneously defending its overseas territories. The challenge was enormous, but it also provided an opportunity for Portugal to refocus its imperial strategy. The Portuguese gradually adopted a more defensive approach, concentrating their resources on the most valuable and defensible territories. In Asia, this meant accepting the loss of many Indonesian possessions to the Dutch, while strengthening their hold on Goa and Macau. In the Americas, it meant prioritizing Brazil, while maintaining smaller outposts in Africa for the slave trade. This strategic retrenchment ultimately proved successful. Portuguese forces managed to expel the Dutch from Brazil by 1654, securing their most valuable American colony. In Asia, the Portuguese adapted to their reduced circumstances by focusing on trade rather than territorial control, maintaining profitable commercial relationships even after losing political dominance. The discovery of gold in Brazil's interior in the 1690s would provide Portugal with new wealth and renewed imperial confidence. But by then, The nature of the Portuguese Empire had fundamentally changed. The freewheeling expansion of the 16th century had given way to a more cautious defensive imperialism focused on protecting core territories rather than acquiring new ones. The Portuguese Empire of the late 17th century was smaller than its earlier incarnation, but also more sustainable. Portugal had learned painful lessons about the limits of its power and the costs of overextension. The empire that emerged from these trials would prove remarkably durable, lasting in some form until the late 20th century. This transformation reflected broader changes in the global balance of power. The age of Iberian dominance was ending, replaced by competition among multiple European powers. Portugal's survival required adaptation to this new reality, abandoning dreams of global hegemony in favor of more modest but achievable goals. The Portuguese Empire's evolution from rapid expansion to strategic consolidation illustrates the challenges facing all early modern empires. Success bred competition. Competition led to conflict, and conflict forced difficult choices about priorities and resources. Portugal's ability to make these choices wisely would determine whether its empire would endure or collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. As the Portuguese Empire consolidated its hold over vast territories spanning from Brazil to Macau in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it faced mounting challenges that would test its ability to maintain such an expansive global domain. The union with Spain from 1580 to 1640, known as the Iberian Union, had initially seemed to strengthen Portugal's position by combining the resources of two mighty empires. However, this political arrangement would ultimately expose Portugal's overseas territories to new vulnerabilities and aggressive competition from emerging European maritime powers. The Dutch, having recently gained their independence from Spanish rule in 1581, emerged as Portugal's most formidable challenger. These skilled merchants and navigators were determined to break the Portuguese monopoly on Asian trade routes and establish their own commercial empire. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, represented a new model of colonial enterprise, a joint stock company with substantial capital resources and government backing that could sustain long-term military and commercial operations across vast distances. Dutch aggression against Portuguese territories intensified throughout the early 17th century. In Asia, they systematically attacked Portuguese trading posts and fortifications, capturing key strategic locations such as Malacca in 1641, Ceylon in 1658, and numerous spice-producing islands in what is now Indonesia. The Dutch strategy was methodical and devastating. They would blockade Portuguese ports, intercept treasure fleets, and offer local rulers better trading terms to switch allegiances. Their superior naval technology, particularly their heavily armed ships designed specifically for long-distance warfare, gave them significant advantages in these conflicts. In Brazil, the Dutch West India Company launched ambitious invasions, capturing substantial portions of the northeastern coast, including the wealthy sugar-producing regions around Recife and Salvador. For nearly 30 years, from 1624 to 1654, the Dutch controlled significant Brazilian territories, establishing their own colonial administration and attempting to transform these regions into profitable sugar colonies using enslaved African labor. This period, known as Dutch Brazil, represented the most serious threat to Portuguese sovereignty in the Americas during the early colonial period. The Portuguese response to these challenges demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. Local Portuguese commanders, often working with limited resources and minimal support from Europe, developed innovative defensive strategies. In Brazil, they formed alliances with indigenous groups and organized guerrilla warfare campaigns that gradually weakened Dutch control. The eventual Portuguese reconquest of northeastern Brazil in 1654 was achieved through a combination of military action, diplomatic pressure, and the exploitation of Dutch overextension across multiple fronts. In Asia, the Portuguese adapted to their reduced circumstances by focusing on territories they could realistically defend while maintaining profitable trading relationships, even in areas under Dutch control. They retained important strongholds such as Goa, Macau, and East Timor, while developing new trading partnerships that bypassed Dutch-controlled routes. This strategic retrenchment, though painful, allowed Portugal to maintain a significant Asian presence, despite losing much of its former dominance. The period also witnessed significant changes in Portugal's relationship with Brazil, which gradually emerged as the crown jewel of the empire. The discovery of gold in the interior regions of Minas Gerais in the 1690s transformed Brazil from a primarily agricultural colony into a major source of precious metals that rivaled the wealth flowing from Spanish America. This Brazilian gold rush attracted massive immigration from Portugal and other parts of Europe, while simultaneously intensifying the demand for enslaved African labor in the mining regions. The wealth generated by Brazilian gold helped finance Portugal's recovery from the losses suffered during the Dutch conflicts. It also enabled significant urban development projects, most notably the reconstruction of Lisbon following the devastating earthquake of 1755. However, this dependence on Brazilian wealth also made Portugal increasingly vulnerable to any disruption of Atlantic trade routes and created a colonial economy heavily reliant on enslaved labor. Throughout this period of contraction and adaptation, Portuguese missionaries continued their efforts to spread Christianity throughout the empire's territories. Jesuit missions played particularly important roles in Brazil, Paraguay, and parts of Asia, often serving as intermediaries between colonial authorities and indigenous populations. These missionary activities, while sometimes accompanied by cultural suppression and forced conversion, also resulted in significant educational and technological transfers that had lasting impacts on colonial societies. The Portuguese Empire's experience during the 17th and early 18th centuries illustrates how imperial powers could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core territorial holdings. Rather than attempting to hold every distant outpost, Portuguese administrators learned to prioritize defensible positions with genuine economic value. This pragmatic approach, combined with skillful diplomacy and tactical flexibility, enabled Portugal to preserve significant portions of its empire, even while losing others to more powerful competitors. The evolution of Portuguese colonial administration during this period also reflected broader changes in European imperial thinking. The empire became more centralized, with the Overseas Council established in 1642, exercising greater control over colonial affairs than had previously existed. Trade regulations became more systematic, and efforts were made to maximize the economic benefits flowing to the metropole, while maintaining colonial loyalty through a combination of rewards and punishments. By the mid-18th century, the Portuguese Empire had stabilized into a more compact, but still globally significant configuration. Brazil remained its most valuable possession, generating enormous wealth through gold, diamonds, sugar, and other agricultural products. In Asia, Portugal maintained important trading centers that continued to generate profits despite Dutch dominance in the region. In Africa, Portuguese control of Angola and Mozambique provided access to enslaved labor and ivory that remained crucial to the empire's economic functioning. This period of consolidation and adaptation set the stage for the challenges that would emerge in the late 18th and 19th centuries as new ideas about political rights and national self-determination began to spread throughout the Atlantic world. The Portuguese Empire had proven its ability to survive military challenges and economic competition, but it would soon face ideological threats that would prove even more difficult to overcome. The seeds of these future challenges were already visible in the growing Creole populations of Brazil and other colonies, who increasingly saw themselves as distinct from their European rulers while remaining tied to Portuguese language, culture, and institutions. Part 4. The Portuguese Empire in Crisis and Transformation, 1580-1643. By 1580, the Portuguese Empire had reached extraordinary heights. From the spice markets of Malacca to the sugar plantations of Brazil, from the Gold Coast of Africa to the trading posts of Nagasaki, Portuguese merchants and administrators governed a global network that generated immense wealth for the crown. Yet this very success would soon become the empire's greatest vulnerability. The death of King Sebastian in 1578 during a disastrous military campaign in Morocco created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter Portugal's trajectory. When Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese throne in 1580, he united the two great Iberian empires under what became known as the Iberian Union, while Portugal theoretically maintained its independence and colonial administration. This political merger exposed the empire to Spain's numerous enemies and conflicts. The union came at a particularly dangerous moment. Spain was simultaneously fighting wars against England, France, and the Dutch Republic. These conflicts, which had previously been Spain's burden alone, now threatened Portuguese interests worldwide. The Dutch, having recently won their independence from Spanish rule, proved especially determined to challenge Iberian dominance in the lucrative Asian trade routes. Dutch merchants and military commanders understood that Portugal's Asian empire, despite its apparent strength, rested on surprisingly fragile foundations. The Estado da India, as the Portuguese called their Asian territories, was essentially a commercial network held together by strategic fortifications and naval superiority. Unlike the massive territorial empires of later centuries, the Portuguese presence in Asia consisted primarily of coastal enclaves, trading posts, and fortified harbors. This system had worked brilliantly when Portugal operated as a neutral or friendly power, able to negotiate with local rulers and maintain its monopolistic position through diplomatic skill and limited military intervention. However, the Iberian Union made Portugal a target for every enemy of Spain, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus throughout the empire. The Dutch struck first, and most effectively. Beginning in the 1590s, Dutch expeditions rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean with a clear mission: to seize control of the spice trade that had made Portugal wealthy. Unlike earlier European interlopers who had sought merely to share in existing trade networks, the Dutch aimed for complete dominance. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, represented a new kind of colonial organization, better financed than its Portuguese counterparts, and backed by the emerging economic power of the Dutch Republic. The company could sustain longer campaigns and absorb greater losses than the increasingly stretched Portuguese forces. Portuguese commanders quickly discovered that their traditional advantages, superior naval technology, knowledge of local conditions, and established relationships with Asian rulers were being systematically undermined. Dutch ships were now equally well-armed and often more numerous. Dutch merchants offered better terms to local suppliers and customers. Most critically, the Dutch demonstrated a willingness to use overwhelming force to achieve their commercial objectives. The siege of Malacca in 1640-1641 exemplified these changing dynamics. For over a century, this strategic port had served as the centerpiece of Portuguese power in Southeast Asia, controlling access to the valuable Spice Islands and serving as a crucial link between India, China, and the Indonesian archipelago. The Dutch siege lasted nearly a year, during which Portuguese defenders, cut off from reinforcement due to other conflicts throughout the empire, gradually weakened. When Malacca finally fell in January 1641, it marked more than the loss of a single city. The Dutch victory demonstrated that Portuguese power in Asia could be systematically dismantled through sustained pressure and superior resources. Other Asian rulers, observing this shift in the balance of power, began reconsidering their relationships with Portugal. The loss of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, followed a similar pattern. Portuguese control over this island had provided access to cinnamon, one of the most valuable spices in European markets, as well as a strategic position controlling shipping lanes between India and Southeast Asia. Dutch forces, working methodically from fortified bases, gradually captured Portuguese strongholds throughout the island. By 1658, the last Portuguese defenders had surrendered, ending over a century of Portuguese presence on Ceylon. These defeats in Asia coincided with equally serious challenges in other parts of the empire. In Brazil, Dutch forces captured large portions of the northeast, including the vital sugar-producing regions around Recife and Salvador. For nearly 3 decades, from 1630 to 1654, the Dutch controlled some of Brazil's most valuable territory, directly competing with Portuguese sugar production and slave trading networks. The Dutch occupation of northeastern Brazil revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Portuguese colonial society. While Dutch forces could capture and hold major cities and ports, they struggled to win the loyalty of the local population. Portuguese colonists, indigenous groups, and even some enslaved Africans formed resistance movements that constantly harassed Dutch forces and supply lines. This resistance culminated in a series of uprisings that gradually pushed Dutch forces back to a few coastal enclaves. The final expulsion of Dutch forces from Brazil in 1654 represented one of the few clear Portuguese victories during this period, demonstrating the resilience of colonial society when fighting for familiar territory and established interests. However, even this success came at enormous cost. The wars in Brazil had drained Portuguese resources and revealed the empire's fundamental problem. It was simply too large and dispersed to defend effectively against multiple determined enemies. Portuguese forces were simultaneously fighting Dutch attacks in Asia, Brazil, and Africa, while also dealing with local rebellions and the ongoing costs of colonial administration. The strain of these conflicts contributed to growing discontent within Portugal itself. Many Portuguese nobles and merchants blamed Spain for involving Portugal in unnecessary wars and failing to provide adequate support for Portuguese interests. The Spanish crown, facing its own financial difficulties and military challenges in Europe, had indeed prioritized Spanish colonial interests over Portuguese ones when forced to choose. This resentment exploded in the Portuguese Restoration War of 1640, when Portuguese nobles overthrew Spanish rule and proclaimed John IV as the new king of an independent Portugal. The restoration of Portuguese independence, however, did not restore Portuguese imperial power. The new Portuguese government inherited an empire under attack on multiple fronts, with depleted resources and weakened defenses. The Dutch continued their systematic conquest of Portuguese territories throughout the 1640s and 1650s. The loss of key trading posts in Indonesia, including Batavia, modern Jakarta, and much of Java, effectively ended Portuguese dominance in the Indonesian spice trade. Portuguese merchants found themselves relegated to minor roles in trade networks they had once controlled. Perhaps more significantly, these defeats marked a fundamental shift in the nature of European colonialism. The Portuguese model of empire, based on controlling strategic points along trade routes and maintaining cooperative relationships with local rulers, was being replaced by a more aggressive Dutch approach that emphasized territorial control and commercial monopolies enforced through superior naval power. The Portuguese response to these challenges revealed both the empire's adaptability and its limitations. Unable to match Dutch resources in Asia, Portuguese administrators focused increasingly on consolidating control over their remaining territories, particularly Brazil and their African coastal enclaves. This strategic retrenchment allowed Portugal to maintain some imperial presence while acknowledging the reality of reduced circumstances. In Brazil, this period saw significant expansion into the interior as Portuguese colonists and their indigenous allies pushed beyond the coastal regions where sugar plantations had dominated the economy. The discovery of gold in Minas Gerais in the 1690s would provide new sources of wealth, but during the middle of the 17th century, Brazilian expansion was driven more by the search for enslaved indigenous people and the need to find defensible territory away from Dutch attacks. The Portuguese also adapted their trading strategies in Africa and Asia. Rather than attempting to maintain territorial control over large areas, they focused on securing key ports and trading posts that could serve as bases for commercial operations. This approach required more cooperative relationships with local rulers and greater reliance on diplomatic negotiation rather than military force. These adaptations reflected broader changes in Portuguese colonial thinking. The confidence and aggressive expansion that had characterized the early empire gave way to a more cautious approach that emphasized survival and consolidation over conquest and growth. Portuguese administrators became more willing to share trade routes with other European powers and to accept subordinate roles in commercial relationships they had once dominated. The Treaty of Methuen, signed with England in 1703, exemplified this new reality. Portugal agreed to preferential trading terms with England in exchange for military protection and guaranteed markets for Portuguese wine. While this arrangement provided some economic benefits, it also marked Portugal's acceptance of junior partner status in relation to emerging maritime powers like England and the Dutch Republic. By 1663, when the Dutch-Portuguese War officially ended, the Portuguese Empire had been fundamentally transformed. It remained substantial. Brazil was growing in importance. African trading posts continued to generate profits, and Portuguese merchants maintained significant operations in Asia. But it was no longer the dominant global maritime power it had been a century earlier. This transformation had profound implications for global trade patterns and colonial development. The Portuguese model of empire, based on maritime networks and commercial relationships, had proven vulnerable to more aggressive and better financed competitors. The Dutch success against Portugal demonstrated that colonial dominance required not just early advantages and superior technology. but also the sustained economic and military resources necessary to defend far-flung territories against determined opponents. The decline of Portuguese power in Asia also opened opportunities for other European nations. English merchants, observing Dutch success against the Portuguese, accelerated their own expansion into Asian markets. French colonial enterprises gained momentum as global trade routes became more competitive and less dominated by any single power. For Portugal itself, these defeats forced a fundamental reconsideration of imperial strategy and national priorities. The empire that emerged from this period of crisis was smaller, but in some ways more sustainable, focused on territories where Portuguese control was most secure and profitable. Brazil, in particular, began to assume the central role in Portuguese imperial thinking that it would maintain until independence in the 19th century. The human cost of this imperial transformation was enormous. Tens of thousands of Portuguese soldiers, sailors, and colonists died in the various conflicts of this period. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were transported to Brazil to work in expanding sugar plantations and later gold mines. Indigenous populations throughout Portuguese territories faced increased pressure as colonial authorities sought to extract maximum profits from their remaining holdings. Yet this period of crisis also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of Portuguese colonial society. Despite military defeats and economic pressures, Portuguese communities in Brazil, Africa, and Asia adapted to changing circumstances and maintained their cultural and commercial networks. The Portuguese language, Catholic religion, and distinctive colonial institutions survived, even where Portuguese political control was lost. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Portuguese Empire stood at a crossroads. The days of unchallenged maritime dominance were over, but new opportunities were emerging. The discovery of gold in Brazil promised fresh sources of wealth. Growing European demand for colonial products offered expanding markets, and the very challenges that had nearly destroyed the empire had also forced innovations and adaptations that would serve Portugal well in the changing global economy of the 18th century. The Portuguese Empire's experience during this period of crisis and transformation illustrates the dynamic nature of early modern colonialism. Imperial power was never static or secure. It required constant adaptation to changing circumstances, competitors, and opportunities. The Portuguese learned this lesson through painful experience, but their ability to adapt and survive would prove crucial to maintaining their imperial presence for centuries to come. By the late 18th century, Portugal found itself at a critical crossroads. The empire that had once dominated global maritime trade now faced existential challenges that would fundamentally reshape its relationship with its vast colonial territories. The wealth of Brazil, particularly from gold and diamonds discovered in Minas Gerais, had provided Portugal with renewed prosperity during much of the 1700s. However, this prosperity masked underlying vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed by the dramatic political upheavals sweeping across the Atlantic world. The catastrophic Lisbon earthquake of 1755 served as more than just a natural disaster. It became a symbol of Portugal's declining fortunes. The destruction of the capital, with its devastating loss of life and infrastructure, drained the royal treasury and exposed the empire's financial fragility. While the Marquis of Pombal's reconstruction efforts modernized aspects of Portuguese governance and urban planning, they could not address the fundamental challenge. facing all European colonial powers. The rising tide of revolutionary sentiment that was beginning to sweep across their overseas territories. The American Revolution of 1795 had demonstrated that colonial independence was not only possible, but achievable through determined resistance. When revolutionary fervor spread to France in 1789, it created ideological currents that would inevitably reach the shores of Portugal's most valuable possession, Brazil. The concepts of liberty, equality, and self-determination that animated these revolutions resonated powerfully with colonial elites who had grown increasingly resentful of metropolitan control and taxation. Portugal's position became even more precarious when Napoleon's armies invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 1807. In an unprecedented move that highlighted the empire's transformed priorities, the Portuguese royal court fled Lisbon and relocated to Rio de Janeiro in 1808. This transfer of the imperial capital from Europe to South America represented a dramatic reversal of traditional colonial relationships. For the first time in history, a European empire was being governed from its colony rather than its metropolitan center. Prince Regent João's decision to elevate Brazil to the status of a kingdom in 1815, creating the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, further accelerated Brazil's evolution toward independence. When the royal family returned to Lisbon in 1821, they left behind Prince Pedro, who quickly recognized that Brazil's interests no longer aligned with those of Portugal. The Declaration of Brazilian Independence in 1822 stripped Portugal of its most valuable colonial possession and reduced the empire to a shadow of its former self. The loss of Brazil forced Portugal to refocus its colonial ambitions on Africa, where it retained control over Angola and Mozambique. During the 19th century, Portuguese administrators developed increasingly elaborate plans for connecting these territories through a transcontinental African empire. The Pink Map project envisioned Portuguese control over a broad swath of south-central Africa, linking the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coasts under a single colonial administration. However, Portugal's African ambitions directly conflicted with British imperial designs for a Cape to Cairo railway and telegraph line. When Britain delivered its ultimatum in 1890, demanding that Portugal abandon its transcontinental plans, the Portuguese government found itself powerless to resist. This humiliation exposed the limitations of Portuguese power in the new age of industrial imperialism, where economic and military capabilities increasingly determined colonial success. The domestic political consequences of this international embarrassment proved severe. The monarchy's inability to defend Portuguese interests against British pressure fueled Republican sentiment and contributed to the growing instability that characterized Portuguese politics in the early 20th century. The assassination of King Carlos III and Crown Prince Luís Filipe in 1908, followed by the Republican Revolution of 1910, reflected the deep political crisis that accompanied Portugal's imperial decline. World War I brought new challenges as German forces threatened Portugal's African colonies. Although Portugal managed to retain its territories through its alliance with Britain, the war highlighted the empire's vulnerability and the enormous costs of maintaining distant colonial possessions. The interwar period saw another political transformation with the establishment of Antonio Salazar's Estado Novo regime in 1933, which adopted a more rigid approach to colonial administration while maintaining Portugal's neutrality during World War II. The post-war era ushered in the final phase of Portuguese imperialism as decolonization movements gained momentum across Africa and Asia. The Indian military action of 1961, which ended Portuguese control over Goa, Daman, and Diu, demonstrated that the old imperial order could no longer be sustained through force alone. Portugal's attempt to maintain its African empire through military means led to the prolonged colonial wars of 1961 to 1974, which ultimately proved both financially ruinous and politically unsustainable. The Carnation Revolution of 1974 brought this era to a decisive close. The new democratic government quickly abandoned the colonial wars and began the process of decolonization that would culminate with the handover of Macau to China in 1999. This final transfer of sovereignty marked the end of one of history's longest-lived maritime empires, bringing to a close more than 5 centuries of Portuguese global expansion. The legacy of the Portuguese Empire extends far beyond its political dissolution. The Portuguese language continues to unite over 250 million speakers across 4 continents, while the maritime routes pioneered by Portuguese navigators remain fundamental to global commerce. Perhaps most significantly, Portugal's early ventures into oceanic exploration established the template for European expansion that would shape the modern world system. From Vasco da Gama's pioneering voyage to India to the establishment of trading networks spanning 3 continents, Portuguese innovations in navigation, cartography, and commercial organization created the foundation upon which subsequent European empires would build. The Portuguese Empire's evolution from aggressive expansion to defensive consolidation, and finally to decolonization, mirrors the broader trajectory of European imperialism. Its story illustrates how maritime technology, commercial innovation, and political adaptability could enable a small European nation to project power across vast oceanic distances, while also demonstrating the ultimate limits of imperial control in an age of rising nationalism and anti-colonial resistance. The empire's transformation from a global maritime network to a collection of memories and cultural connections reflects the fundamental changes that have reshaped international relations from the age of exploration to the modern era of sovereign nation-states. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Portuguese Empire that had once commanded the seas from Brazil to Macau found itself increasingly fragile, its golden age of maritime dominance a fading memory. The empire that Prince Henry the Navigator had launched from the shores of Portugal now faced existential threats that would fundamentally reshape its character and drastically reduce its scope. The Napoleonic storm that swept across Europe in the early 1800s struck Portugal with devastating force. As French armies marched toward Lisbon in 1807, the unthinkable occurred. For the first time in Portuguese history, the royal court abandoned the homeland that had birthed their empire. Prince Regent João, later King João VI, made the extraordinary decision to relocate the entire Portuguese court across the Atlantic to Brazil. This wasn't merely an evacuation. It was a complete inversion of imperial hierarchy. Rio de Janeiro, once a colonial outpost established to extract wealth for Lisbon, suddenly became the beating heart of the Portuguese Empire. The transformation was remarkable. Brazilian ports opened to international trade for the first time, ending centuries of Portuguese mercantile monopoly. The colony that had been systematically drained of its riches now hosted the very institutions that had exploited it. Libraries, academies, and printing presses appeared virtually overnight. The cultural flowering was unprecedented. Yet this reversal of fortune contained the seeds of Brazil's eventual independence. When the royal family finally returned to Portugal in 1821, leaving behind Prince Pedro as regent, they had fundamentally altered the relationship between colony and metropole. Brazil had tasted autonomy and found it intoxicating. The colony had become accustomed to governing itself, to direct participation in global commerce, to being the center rather than the periphery. The inevitable rupture came swiftly. In 1822, Prince Pedro declared Brazil's independence, crowning himself Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. With one dramatic gesture, Portugal lost the jewel of its empire, the territory that had sustained it through 2 centuries of decline elsewhere. The economic impact was catastrophic. Brazil had provided not just gold and diamonds, but sugar, coffee, and the profits from the slave trade. Suddenly, Portugal found itself reduced to its African enclaves and a handful of Asian trading posts. This loss of Brazil exposed the fundamental weakness that had been growing within the Portuguese Empire for generations. Unlike the British, who had built an industrial base to support their imperial ambitions, or the French, who had created sophisticated administrative systems, Portugal had remained largely dependent on the extraction of wealth from its colonies. When Brazil departed, it took with it the economic foundation upon which the entire imperial structure rested. In Africa, Portugal still maintained its ancient territories of Angola and Mozambique, but these were shadows of their former importance. The slave trade, which had once made these colonies profitable, was under increasing international pressure. Britain, having abolished slavery in its own empire, was now aggressively suppressing the slave trade globally, patrolling the West African coast and intercepting Portuguese slave ships. The economic model that had sustained Portuguese Africa for 3 centuries was crumbling. The Portuguese response was to double down on territorial expansion in Africa. The Pink Map Plan emerged in the 1880s, an ambitious scheme to connect Angola and Mozambique by claiming the vast interior of south-central Africa. Portuguese explorers and officials began pushing inland, establishing posts and negotiating treaties with local chiefs. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Portugal might carve out a new continental empire in Africa to replace what it had lost in Brazil. But Portugal was no longer operating in the world of the 16th century, when small European nations could claim vast territories with minimal opposition. The scramble for Africa was underway, and Portugal found itself competing with far more powerful European rivals. The British, in particular, had their own plans for African expansion. Their Cape to Cairo vision directly conflicted with Portugal's Pink Map scheme. The confrontation came to a head in 1890 with the British ultimatum. Britain delivered a stark choice: abandon the Pink Map or face the consequences. Portugal, militarily weak and diplomatically isolated, had no choice but to capitulate. The humiliation was complete and public. The nation that had once defied the Pope to claim new worlds now bent the knee to British demands. This diplomatic defeat sent shockwaves through Portuguese society. The monarchy, already weakened by centuries of decline and the loss of Brazil, faced a crisis of legitimacy. How could a royal house that had once commanded global respect now submit so meekly to foreign pressure? Republican sentiment, which had been growing throughout the 19th century, found fertile ground in this national humiliation. The final decades of the 19th century saw Portugal struggling to maintain relevance in a world that had largely passed it by. The empire that had pioneered global trade routes now watched as other nations dominated the very sea lanes Portugal had discovered. British steamships carried goods along routes first charted by Portuguese navigators. Dutch merchants traded in spices from islands Portugal had once controlled. Spanish, English, and French had become the languages of international commerce, while Portuguese retreated to its remaining corners of Africa and Asia. In Asia, the remnants of Portuguese power clung to life in isolated enclaves. Goa, once the proud capital of Portuguese India, had become an anachronism, surrounded by British territory and increasingly cut off from its homeland. Macau survived as a trading post, but its importance had been superseded by British Hong Kong. The Estado da India, once a maritime empire stretching from the Red Sea to Japan, had been reduced to a few scattered fortresses and trading posts. The Portuguese attempted various reforms to revitalize their remaining empire. The Regeneração period saw efforts to modernize infrastructure, improve education, and stimulate economic development. Railways were built in Africa, telegraphs connected distant outposts, and new agricultural techniques were introduced. But these reforms came too late, and with too little resources to fundamentally alter Portugal's imperial trajectory. The abolition of slavery, finally completed in Portuguese territories in 1878, removed one of the last profitable enterprises sustaining the African colonies. Without slave labor to extract wealth, and without the industrial capacity to develop these territories along modern lines, Portugal struggled to make its African empire economically viable. The colonies became drains on the metropolitan treasury rather than sources of wealth. Meanwhile, the very nature of empire was changing around Portugal. The informal empire of economic influence was becoming as important as formal political control. Portugal lacked the industrial might to compete in this new arena. While British manufacturers flooded global markets with textiles and machinery, and German banks financed development projects worldwide, Portugal remained largely agricultural and economically dependent. The Portuguese Empire of 1900 bore little resemblance to the global powerhouse of 1500, where once Portuguese ships had been the masters of the Indian Ocean, carrying spices, silk, and precious metals between continents. Now Portugal's imperial possessions were marginal territories, sustained more by historical inertia than economic vitality. The empire had become a burden rather than a benefit, a source of national pride, but also of international embarrassment. Yet even in decline, the Portuguese Empire retained certain characteristics that distinguished it from its rivals. Portuguese colonialism had always been more adaptable, more willing to accommodate local customs and intermarry with indigenous populations. This flexibility, which had once been a source of strength, now helped Portuguese territories avoid some of the violent uprisings that plagued other European empires. But it could not disguise the fundamental reality. Portugal was no longer a significant imperial power. The 19th century had witnessed the transformation of the Portuguese Empire from a global maritime network to a collection of scattered territories held together more by historical accident than strategic design. The age of Portuguese expansion was definitively over. The empire that had once connected continents now struggled to maintain control over the fragments that remained. As the century drew to a close, thoughtful observers could see that even these remnants would not survive indefinitely in a world increasingly dominated by new forms of power and new definitions of empire. The Portuguese Empire entered the 20th century not as a dynamic force shaping global events, but as a relic of an earlier age, sustained by historical momentum, but lacking the vitality to regenerate itself. The Great Age of Portuguese expansion, which had begun with the capture of Ceuta in 1415, was drawing toward its inevitable conclusion. The empire that had taught Europe how to navigate the world's oceans would soon learn the hard lesson that all empires must eventually face. that what expansion creates, time and circumstance can just as surely destroy. The Portuguese Empire's journey into the 20th century was marked by a series of mounting pressures that would ultimately force Portugal to confront the end of its colonial era. As the new century dawned, the empire that had once pioneered global maritime exploration found itself increasingly isolated in a world moving toward decolonization. The early 1900s brought significant internal upheaval to Portugal itself. The assassination of King Carlos III and Prince Luís Felipe in 1908 shocked the nation and exposed the deep fractures within Portuguese society. When King Manuel II fled the country just 2 years later during the Republican Revolution of 1910, it marked not just the end of the monarchy, but also a fundamental shift in how Portugal would approach its overseas territories. The newly established Portuguese Republic inherited an empire that was already showing signs of strain. Unlike the dynamic expansion of previous centuries, the early 20th century Portuguese Empire was largely defensive in nature, focused on maintaining control over existing territories rather than acquiring new ones. The administrative challenges of governing vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, with limited resources and manpower, were becoming increasingly apparent. World War I brought new challenges to Portuguese colonial administration. Although Portugal initially attempted to remain neutral, German submarine attacks on Portuguese shipping and pressure from Britain eventually drew the nation into the conflict. In 1916, the war years saw Portuguese colonial forces fighting German troops in both Angola and Mozambique, campaigns that drained the metropolitan treasury and highlighted the vulnerability of Portugal's African territories. The German strategy in Africa specifically targeted Portuguese weaknesses, launching raids from German East Africa into Mozambique and from German Southwest Africa into Angola. These attacks, while ultimately unsuccessful in permanently displacing Portuguese control, demonstrated how easily the empire's far-flung territories could be threatened by a determined enemy. The Portuguese colonial armies, composed largely of African troops led by Portuguese officers, performed creditably, but at considerable cost to the colonial administration. Perhaps more significantly, the war accelerated changes in global attitudes toward colonialism. The rhetoric of self-determination, promoted by President Woodrow Wilson, and the increasing emphasis on national sovereignty in international law began to undermine the philosophical foundations of European imperialism. Portugal, as one of the smaller colonial powers, found itself particularly vulnerable to these shifting winds of international opinion. The interwar period brought the rise of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar and the Estado Novo regime in 1933. Salazar's authoritarian government brought a new approach to colonial administration, emphasizing the concept of a unified Portuguese nation stretching from the Minho River to Timor. This ideological framework, known as Lusotropicalism, argued that the Portuguese had a unique gift for tropical colonization and racial harmony that distinguished their empire from other European colonial projects. Under the Estado Novo, significant investments were made in colonial infrastructure, particularly in Angola and Mozambique. New ports, railways, and agricultural projects were undertaken with the goal of making the colonies economically self-sufficient while providing raw materials for Portuguese industry. The regime also encouraged white settlement in Africa, hoping to create stable Portuguese communities that would anchor colonial control. However, these efforts could not mask the fundamental contradictions inherent in maintaining a colonial empire in the modern era. The administrative costs of colonial rule continued to outweigh the economic benefits for Portugal, which remained one of Europe's poorest countries. More importantly, the rise of nationalist movements throughout Africa and Asia posed an existential challenge to Portuguese colonial authority. The loss of Portuguese India marked a crucial turning point in the empire's decline. The incorporation of Goa, Daman, and Diu into independent India in 1961 was not just a territorial loss, but a powerful symbol of colonialism's vulnerability in the post-war world. Despite Salazar's refusal to recognize Indian sovereignty over these territories, the international community largely accepted the fait accompli, leaving Portugal diplomatically isolated. The Portuguese Colonial War, which began in 1961 with uprisings in Angola, represented the death throes of the Portuguese Empire. Unlike other European powers that had negotiated relatively peaceful transitions to independence for their colonies, Portugal chose to fight a prolonged military campaign to maintain colonial control. This decision reflected both Salazar's ideological commitment to empire and Portugal's economic dependence on its African territories. The war expanded to Guinea-Bissau in 1963 and Mozambique in 1964, forcing Portugal to maintain substantial military forces across 3 different theaters. At its peak, the Portuguese military had over 150,000 troops deployed in Africa, representing an enormous burden for a country with limited resources. The conflict consumed vast amounts of Portugal's national budget and imposed military service on an entire generation of Portuguese men. The human cost of the colonial war was staggering. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers died in African campaigns, while the civilian populations of Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique suffered even greater losses. The use of napalm, forced resettlement programs, and other harsh counterinsurgency tactics increasingly isolated Portugal from international opinion and violated emerging norms of international humanitarian law. Domestically, the colonial war created deep divisions within Portuguese society. Many families lost sons in Africa, while the economic costs of the military campaigns contributed to Portugal's continued underdevelopment compared to other Western European nations. By the early 1970s, even military officers were beginning to question the wisdom of continuing the fight. The end came suddenly with the Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974. A group of military officers, many of whom had served in Africa and witnessed firsthand the futility of the colonial war, overthrew the Estado Novo regime in a largely bloodless coup. The new democratic government immediately began negotiations for the independence of Portugal's African colonies. The decolonization process was rapid but chaotic. Angola and Mozambique gained independence in 1975, followed by Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and São Tomé and Príncipe. The sudden Portuguese withdrawal, combined with Cold War rivalries and ethnic divisions within the new nations, led to prolonged civil wars in both Angola and Mozambique that would continue for decades. The Portuguese departure from Africa was accompanied by a massive refugee crisis as hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers fled the newly independent territories. These retornados, as they were called, faced significant challenges integrating into Portuguese society and represented a living reminder of the empire's collapse. East Timor's incorporation into Indonesia in 1975 represented another traumatic chapter in Portuguese decolonization. Portugal's abandonment of this small territory during the chaos of the Carnation Revolution enabled Indonesian occupation and led to decades of oppression for the Timorese people. Only in 1999, following a UN-supervised referendum, did East Timor achieve independence. The final act of Portuguese decolonization came with the handover of Macau to China in 1999. Unlike the hasty departures from Africa, the Macau transition was carefully negotiated and peaceful, perhaps reflecting both Portugal's and China's desire to avoid the chaos that had marked earlier decolonizations. The end of the Portuguese Empire marked the conclusion of one of history's longest-lived colonial projects. From Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 to the handover of Macau in 1999, the Portuguese Empire had endured for over 5 centuries, outlasting the Spanish, Dutch, French, and British empires. The legacy of Portuguese colonialism remains complex and contested. Portuguese explorers and colonizers undoubtedly played a crucial role in creating the first truly global economy, establishing trade routes and cultural connections that persist to this day. The Portuguese language, spoken by over 250 million people worldwide, represents perhaps the most enduring legacy of the empire. However, this legacy must also account for the tremendous human cost of Portuguese colonialism. The Atlantic slave trade, which transported millions of Africans to Brazil and other Portuguese territories, represents one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. The exploitation of colonial resources and labor enriched Portugal, while impoverishing many of its colonial subjects. The Portuguese Empire's approach to colonial rule, often characterized as more racially tolerant than other European empires, has been increasingly questioned by historians. While Portuguese colonial society did exhibit greater racial mixing than British or French colonies, this reflected practical necessities rather than ideological commitments to equality. The colonial hierarchies remained fundamentally based on race and European supremacy. Contemporary Portugal continues to grapple with its colonial past. The country's relationship with its former colonies, organized through the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, represents an attempt to maintain cultural and economic ties while respecting political independence. However, these relationships remain complicated by historical grievances and economic inequalities. The Portuguese Empire's rise and fall offers important lessons about the dynamics of global power and the limits of imperial ambition. Portugal's initial success stemmed from its willingness to embrace maritime technology and exploration at a time when other European powers were focused on continental affairs. The small nation's ability to establish a global empire demonstrated how technological advantages and strategic positioning could compensate for limited demographic and economic resources. However, the empire's eventual decline also illustrated the unsustainability of colonial rule in the modern era. Portugal's attempt to maintain its African empire through military force in the 1960s and 1970s proved both economically ruinous and morally untenable. The colonial war consumed resources that could have been used for domestic development and isolated Portugal from the international community. The Portuguese Empire's end also reflected broader changes in the international system. The rise of the United States and Soviet Union as superpowers, both officially opposed to European colonialism, created a hostile environment for traditional imperial powers. The emergence of the United Nations and the codification of principles of self-determination in international law provided legal and moral frameworks for challenging colonial rule. Perhaps most importantly, the growth of indigenous nationalist movements in Africa and Asia demonstrated that colonial rule ultimately depended on the consent of the governed. When that consent was withdrawn, as it was throughout the Portuguese Empire in the 1960s and 1970s, even prolonged military campaigns could not preserve colonial control. Today, The Portuguese Empire exists only in historical memory and cultural legacy. The great caravels that once carried Portuguese explorers to distant shores have been replaced by modern cargo vessels following many of the same routes first charted 5 centuries ago. The trading posts and fortresses that once anchored Portuguese power have become museums and tourist attractions, silent witnesses to an age when a small European nation briefly commanded a global empire. The transformation of Portugal from imperial power to modern European democracy represents one of the most dramatic political changes of the 20th century. The country that once ruled territories on 4 continents is now a member of the European Union, NATO, and other international organizations that emphasize cooperation rather than domination. This transformation was not without its costs. The sudden loss of empire forced Portugal to reimagine its national identity and international role. The country that had once prided itself on its global reach had to learn to function as a medium-sized European nation. The economic adjustment was particularly difficult, as Portugal lost access to colonial markets and raw materials, just as it was attempting to modernize its economy. However, the end of empire also brought opportunities. Released from the burden of defending far-flung territories, Portugal could focus on domestic development and European integration. The Democratic Revolution of 1974 not only ended the colonial wars, but also opened the door to political and economic modernization that would have been impossible under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. The Portuguese Empire's legacy in its former territories remains equally complex. Countries like Brazil have emerged as major regional powers, drawing on Portuguese-introduced institutions, language, and cultural practices while developing distinctly national identities. Angola and Mozambique, devastated by post-independence civil wars, are still working to overcome the legacy of colonial exploitation and hasty decolonization in assessing the Portuguese Empire's place in world history. It is important to recognize both its pioneering role in creating global connections and its participation in systems of exploitation and oppression. The same maritime networks that enabled cultural exchange and economic development also facilitated the slave trade and colonial extraction. The Portuguese Empire embodied both the promise and the tragedy of European expansion. The empire's ultimate contribution to world history may lie not in its territorial extent or duration, but in its demonstration of how technological innovation and entrepreneurial spirit could enable a small nation to achieve global influence. Portugal's example inspired other European powers to pursue their own imperial ambitions, setting in motion the process of globalization that continues to shape our world today. At the same time, the Portuguese Empire's eventual collapse illustrated the limits of imperial power and the ultimate triumph of self-determination over colonial rule. The struggles for independence in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau became symbols of anti-colonial resistance worldwide, inspiring similar movements throughout Africa and Asia. As we reflect on the 5-century span of the Portuguese Empire, we see a story that encompasses the full range of human experience, courage and cruelty, innovation and exploitation, cultural exchange and violent conquest. The Portuguese explorers who first rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea were genuine pioneers who expanded the boundaries of human knowledge and possibility, yet their achievements came at an enormous cost to the peoples they encountered and subjugated. The Portuguese Empire's story reminds us that historical progress is never linear or unambiguous. The same forces that create new opportunities and connections can also generate suffering and injustice. The challenge for contemporary societies is to learn from this history, preserving what was valuable in the Portuguese imperial experience while rejecting what was harmful. In our interconnected 21st century world, the Portuguese Empire's legacy continues to influence global affairs. The trade routes pioneered by Portuguese navigators remain vital arteries of international commerce. The cultural and linguistic ties forged during the colonial period continue to shape diplomatic and economic relationships. The struggles over decolonization continue to influence how we think about sovereignty, self-determination, and international law. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Portuguese Empire's history is the reminder that all human institutions, no matter how powerful or enduring they may seem, are ultimately temporary. The empire that once stretched from Brazil to Macau, that controlled the sea routes to Asia and dominated the African coast, ultimately proved unable to adapt to changing historical circumstances. Its fall reminds us that power must be exercised responsibly, and that the consent of the governed cannot be taken for granted indefinitely. The Portuguese Empire began with a handful of ships setting sail from Lisbon harbor in search of new routes to Asia. It ended with the lowering of the Portuguese flag over Macau as the last colonial governor departed for home. Between these two moments stretched 5 centuries of human drama on a global scale, encompassing exploration and exploitation, cultural exchange and violent conquest, technological innovation, and imperial overreach. Today, as we face new challenges of globalization, climate change, and international cooperation, the Portuguese Empire's history offers both inspiration and warning. It reminds us of humanity's capacity for both remarkable achievement and terrible destruction, and of our continuing responsibility to learn from the past as we shape the future. The age of empires may be over, but the human story of exploration, connection, and the search for meaning across vast distances continues in new forms, carrying forward both the promise and the burden of our shared history.